In what part of your life right now would you say you're struggling most to trust God? Is there a health issue that you're stressing about? And maybe it's not you, maybe it's someone close to you, but trusting God with this health issue is difficult. Or maybe it's something financial you can't see your way out of, so much uncertainty. Or it's a relationship, or it's work-related, or well, I think you get the picture. We've all got our stuff that makes trusting God a struggle. Well, for this edition of the Discover the Word podcast, Elisa Morgan is going to call those trust trials.
A trust trial is a season of struggle where we have to put into practice what we believe about God.
Yeah, because in those times of crisis, those trust trials, we wonder sometimes, where did God go? Why has He allowed this? Will He ever intervene? And if so, why not now? Well, Elisa will be taking us to the gospel accounts of a time when Jesus' disciples were out on the Sea of Galilee in a boat during a storm, waves crashing, wind howling, rain pelting down, and Jesus told them to trust Him. And so, will they? Will we, when we hit those trust trials that we experience in life? We'll discover the Word with us next. And in this edition of the Discover the Word podcast, we're going to learn some things from the disciples' trust trial that can shape us in the trust trials that we face. Discover the Word is Bible engagement for life from Our Daily Bread Ministries. And for this episode, the group consists of Elisa and Bill Crowder and Daniel Ryan Day and Rasul Berry. And they'll be digging into this incident that's found in several of the Gospels and breaking down 5 aspects of this trust trial that can help us process our own times of struggle to trust God. And so, to begin, I think it'll be helpful just to acknowledge that this struggle is real. It was real for the disciples, and we all have times when trusting God has a lot of challenges. A common characteristic of a trust trial is that it's a struggle.
Let's start off by just jumping down a few floors in the elevator, okay?
Mm-hmm. You always make me nervous when you say things like that.
I know. That's my specialty, I know. Let's each of us, and I'll give you a second to think about it, maybe I can go first, describe a time where you really had a struggle in your relationship with God. It's like you had a struggle applying what you believe in your real life. And for me, a lot of listeners know that my brother received a liver transplant. Finally! There was a trust trial before he received it, one of waiting for 3.5 years for that. And what that means is he gets to have a shot at life again. But it also means that my husband, Evan, and I get to caregive for him. So we live in Denver and he lives in California. And the agreement is that the chief caregiver, moi, arranges for 24/7 care for him. And most of the time it's me or Evan, which means that Evan and I typically pass in the air. I mean, for 7 weeks, we saw each other for 20 minutes at the airport. That was it. And, that's all the while you're keeping up with your jobs and other family members and such. And I just got to say, besides being weary, there were times I thought, Lord, this is never going to end. When is he ever going to get a little bit more independent? And when can, I have my life back? And while I'm so grateful, I don't think I totally understood what I was agreeing to do. And I completely didn't feel like I had the energy and the sustenance to do it. So that's my current trust trial, my struggle with God. How about you guys?
Well, first, I'm just grateful to hear about the transplant happening. And it's just such a beautiful thing to see you and Evan caring for him in that way. When I think about one of the most challenging trust trials in my life, it happened on the heels of one of the clearest callings that I'd ever sensed from God, to move to Indiana to launch a music ministry that I was leading. Now, this was in a missionary organization where everybody had to raise their support. And it started to become clear after, the allotted amount of time, let's say like a year, that 3 of the 5 band members were really struggling with raising their support. Like they were only at like 50%, and we had like 3 months to go. And I remember as a leader wondering, do I begin to prepare mentally and strategically to have life without these 3 people and having to make it work? Or do I step out and say, no, we still want to pray and trust God that he can raise the money in this very short amount of time, making up for 50% when in 3 months when we hadn't seen that come in, almost a year or over a year. And we decided to try, put it all out there and just cry out to God. And in the 11th hour, somebody stepped up and provided the needs for the other 3 band members, and they were able to report. But it was really a test of trust on several fronts. As a leader, as a person, is like, do I really believe that God can do that?
Yeah.
Well, for me, when you asked when there was a trust trial where I kind of struggled in relationship with God, I can think of 10 or 15 of them, and some of them are health related. Most of them actually are job related.
Yeah.
I was dismissed from a position, having been offered a position at a different ministry, and the day after they released me, I found out the other position wasn't going to work out.
Eek. Yeah.
And so here I've got a wife, 5 kids, and a mortgage, and not knowing where income's going to come from once the severance period ended, and that was a tough go.
Yeah, I have a long list as well. But I think if I'm most honest about where I struggle with trusting God the most, it's probably just about every day. And it's the days that I don't struggle with that surprise me.
That's honest.
It's the days where I experience God's presence in a very real way that feel like the anomaly or the surprise. And I feel like most of life for me is hard questions that I walk with.
Yeah.
That kind of made me wonder, even Elisa, when you said, what was a trust trial kind of thing? I mean, it seems to me like all of them are.
Life.
Some are bigger than others, but all of life is a trust trial where we're learning day by day what it means to walk by faith and not by sight. I just feel that in the everyday.
And we could just turn off the recording right now and say, there you go, because that is a huge principle of life. And it's counterintuitive to how many of us come into the faith. We think that once we know Jesus, that life is going to be smoother. But in reality, it is a journey. It's a constant questioning of, well, now what do I really believe about God? And we're going to look at this one story in Scripture that's contained in a couple other Gospels. So it's in Matthew, it's in Mark, and it's in John. And it's a very classic example of a trust trial. But as we dive into it, let me just define this, that a trust trial is a season of struggle, a specific season of struggle, okay, is how I'm defining it, where we have to put into practice what we believe about God. And it begins with a time of struggle, a time of wrestling, a time of pushback, okay? And so we're going to look at this story of Jesus walking on the water to the disciples who are experiencing a storm in the middle of the lake. And what I want us to do in our conversation is actually, I'm going to be pulling out various elements of a trust trial because they help us identify what's happening and place ourselves within it and then move forward in it. So the first element we're going to look at as we open this passage is the element of struggle. A trust trial is a struggle. It's not easy. It's complicated. Let's turn to Matthew 14, verses 22 to 26. And let's go around and read that.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it.
Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear.
So who are the people here? We've got disciples, we've got,
Jesus.
okay, and
There's the crowd that was dismissed.
Yep. And specifically, Mark tells us in his version, and that's Mark 6, he tells us that they were in the middle of the lake, and the word Mark uses is they were straining at the oars. That verb there is really dramatic. It says they were tormented. So this suffering we're talking about in all of our examples of struggle, this is legit. This is not like, I can't potty train my dog. This is really suffering stuff. Okay, then Jesus comes walking, and Mark tells us in the 4th watch of the night. Okay, that's really late. They've been out there a long time, and they've probably rode 3 to 4 miles. And he comes walking on the water. And, some commentaries say that that's really a sign of his deity, which makes total sense. When they cry out, what do they cry out?
It's a ghost.
It's a ghost.
Yeah, well, hello. Is that also terrified? Yes, completely. And Matthew says they're buffeted by the waves, and then they see this ghost coming, so now they're terrified. What I want us to see as we really take apart this specific trust trial is the genuine struggle that they are facing. We're going to get into what happened before, what happened after, and what happens actually in this moment in our ongoing conversation here. But if we can sit with this as we just did with our own and legitimize what we just said, that our walk with God is an ongoing trust trial. It's an ongoing struggle. And, if you follow Peter on through the Gospels and into his service in the early church after Jesus dies and is resurrected, you're going to see him write something like, don't be surprised at the painful trial that you're suffering, as though something strange was happening to you. Trust trials are normal. And as we enter this one with the disciples, I really hope we can discover some principles that help us survive them and thrive also in them, and learn that we can see more and learn more about our good God who allows them for our understanding of who he is and what he can give us in them.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an important hour for us as we identify these layers of the trust trial that the disciples experienced and reflect on how we experience the trust trials that we face all throughout our lives. They really are a struggle, and as we'll see, there are several different outcomes that are possible depending on how we respond. And so the people that you trust the most, how did they gain your trust? Well, leading up to this next part of the conversation, Elisa said,
So respond to this statement. Trust is not automatic, it's earned.
Absolutely correct.
Wow, they were pretty quick to respond, weren't they? And so what do you think? Is automatic or is it earned? Because I think you'll agree, the people that we tend to trust most are those who have proven to be trustworthy in the past. We have history with them, and they've earned our trust. But don't we sometimes trust when we don't have an extensive history as well? Well, that's related to this next part of the trust trial experience.
I think it's interesting that, if you think about when you, quote, came to know God, trust is our response to who God is. And it's like we're asked to trust him and move forward in trust, but trust is earned, right? Mm-hmm. So, is there a way in which we begin to trust God and then our trust grows over time?
Yeah, I think spiritually, when I think about my own journey, I think my journey of trusting God started with my realization that I was over trusting myself. So
good.
The more I started to realize that I was not fully trustworthy in being able to understand what was right and wrong, it opened me up to the story and the promises of a God who is trustworthy. And then when I took that step, the more I took those steps, the more I saw how trustworthy God, in fact, was, especially in comparison to my own track records.
Yeah. And I would say for me that my trust in God came because of trust in other people that I found trustworthy. So my parents and what they would tell me about God, a pastor that I was under for a long time and what he would say about God. And so my trust was probably less in God at first and more in trusting the people who told me God was trustworthy and leaning into God that way.
Yeah, I think for me, if I could take that same idea and turn it just a little bit, for me, my trust in God came out of trusting the Bible, because I had grown up in church, but in a church that didn't really preach the gospel. It was a church that occasionally preached the Bible, and I would hear things out of the Bible, and they had a ring of truth to them, and so I would trust it. And then when I heard the gospel, I trusted the gospel because I'd seen enough evidence that the Bible was trustworthy, so I trusted the God of the Bible.
As we talk about trust trials, a struggle where we fall back on, well, what do we really believe about God? Is he trustworthy? This element I want us to look at in this conversation is the element of, I'm calling it preparation. What groundwork, what layers have already been given to us so that when we're in a struggle, there is something that we go back to. And, whether it's the point of need, like you said, Russell, where I can't do it all, or Daniel, people have really encouraged me and I trust them. Or Bill, Scripture helps me look towards God and I kind of trust it, but I'm figuring this out. Okay, let's go back to Matthew 14. This is a story of Jesus walking on the water, but it's really a story of trust, isn't it? And it's also in Mark and it's in John. And all three of those have this element of preparation. So it's like what's happening in the disciples' walks with Jesus before they get in a boat, before he comes to them on the water. So we're going to go through a section of Scripture and let's listen for the preparation. We're going to look at Matthew 14, verses 1 through 21. And we're going to take the first section together. This is the story of Herod. So Bill, would you start us off in verse 1?
Matthew 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet.
On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison.
His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus.
Okay, so this is context before the situation on the water before. This is a huge struggle in itself. We're not told specifically if the disciples are right there when all this happens, are we? It's John's disciples, John the Baptist's disciples, who come and take the body and bury it. But then they go and tell Jesus. Let's go on and read verse 13 to 21. There's another situation, preparation, that comes before this time on the water. You want to pick that up in verse 13?
When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick.
As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat."
"We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
Okay. A lot of drama. What stands out to you in these 2 very strong experiences that precede the time on the water in the boat?
Yeah, I mean, we have to read into it a little bit because it doesn't say like Jesus felt this emotion, but the fact that it tells us he withdrew privately to a solitary place, I hear in that mourning and grief and stress and all of the things that we feel when not just someone dies, but in this case, someone's been murdered horrifically. And it's somebody that Jesus doesn't just know, he's related. And then the idea that all these crowds come in the midst of that grief and suffering for Jesus, and yet he still has compassion on them. That really speaks a lot.
And if you put yourself in the shoes of the disciples who hear about John the Baptist's death, so violent, so horrible, and Jesus goes to a solitary place, so you're watching him in pain. You watch him go off. Okay, and then the crowds are coming, pressing on him when he is in pain, and yet still he has compassion on them and he wants to come and feed them. And he says, give them something to eat to you. Now, what do you think the disciples may have been experiencing?
Inadequacy.
Mm-hmm. And then the disciples watch him feed 5,000 people and watch this excess that happens. This is, again, before they're getting in the boat, before the storm's going to come up, before they're afraid, before they're tormented. They're watching the power of Jesus at work. The point here is that when we experience the struggle of a trust trial, I think it's helpful if we pause and remember how we have experienced God's preparation for it. A trust trial is a time when we have to decide what we believe about God, but it's also a time when we lean back on how God has already demonstrated his trustworthiness, where we lean back on the relational collateral we have as we walk in him.
Yeah, I think of a situation in Scripture that's exactly what you're talking about, Elise, and that's with David and the challenge with Goliath. And when Saul says, you're just a kid, you can't go fight this guy, he's a great warrior. And David says, I was watching my father's sheep, and there was a lion and there was a bear. And by the strength of the God who enabled me to take care of those two problems, I'm going to deal with this problem. The investment of God's working in our lives in the past that sometimes carries us through the trial of the present.
I mean, like what Daniel's saying, my parents taught me that God is trustworthy. And so when he's in a spot of going, are you God? He might think back on that and say, yeah, I remember they told me that. And yeah, I saw that. Or Bill's scripture tells me that God's trustworthy. And just like you just went to, Bill, here's the story of David fighting Goliath. Yep, he is trustworthy. And for you, Russell, when it's, I'm in a spot of panic here, I'm going to fall, I'm not enough for myself, and I do reach out, and wow, he does catch me. It's ongoing. For me, I just freak out at the beginning of a trust trial especially. I don't have enough here. You're not enough here. But when I pause and go, wait, you are, because I know you have been this way. And God builds on that in our lives, all through our lives, if we pause and notice.
Yeah, we have been prepared. We've seen who God is and what he's like. The disciples had been prepared in their time with Jesus, and so have we. And so that's an important aspect of a trust trial, remembering that there is a foundation on which we stand and remembering that Jesus is trustworthy. That can help us respond to the trust trial that we're going through right now. Well, the next aspect of the trust trial that the disciples experienced that we'll often see as part of the trust trials that we go through is one that can take us by surprise because, we've been prepared. We believe that God is trustworthy. But when we most want to feel secure in trusting that God is faithful, what we feel sometimes is anxiety that he isn't present in at least the way we thought he would be. In fact, it feels like he's absent, silent. There's a disconnect. Ever felt that? Well, when that feeling of separation is part of a trust trial. After this break, for a word from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Now, as Elisa leads the group in this study of a trust trial, I want to tell you about some podcast episodes from another aspect of the ministry that she's part of that will complement these conversations. It's the God Hears Her podcast, a podcast by women for women who are in the trenches of the beautiful and the messy moments of relationships and work and ministry and more. Hosts Elisa Morgan, Aaron Eddie Adkins, and Vivian Mabuni are joined by a variety of guests who share their personal stories of hope and encouragement. And an episode that I think fits well with this Trust Trials study that we're doing is when Sochiel Dixon joined the God Hears Her team to discuss what it looks like to trust God's plan and pace, even in the midst of suffering. In this episode titled, When I'm in Pain, you'll discover how God can use even the tough parts of life to draw you to Himself. And I think it illustrates when the trust trial is a really long one. Sochiel is the author of several books, and she contributes to our Daily Bread devotional on a regular basis. She's an encouragement to me, and how in her battle with chronic pain, she's found God to be faithful through her struggles. It's an episode of the God Hears Her podcast that you won't forget. And you can find a link to that episode of the God Hears Her podcast with Sochiel Dixon in our show notes for this week at discovertheword.org. And we'll also give you links to several other episodes as well. Look for those links in the show notes of this Discover the Word study at discovertheword.org. All right, so in these trust trials, in those seasons of struggle, when we face the challenge of putting into practice what we say we believe about God, the distance that we feel in our times of struggle, wondering where God is in all of this, can take us by surprise. So what do we do with that? Well, that's what this next part of the conversation addresses.
How do you respond to life when you feel super in step with Jesus versus how do you respond to life when you're not sure where He went?
Confidence versus uncertainty.
Yeah, confidence. That's a great word, Bill.
Peacefulness and patience versus a cynicism and a hurriedness.
Yeah, there you go.
Purposeful and peaceful versus anxious and disordered.
It makes me think of under control versus out of control.
Calm versus chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I get out of control, I become very controlling. There you go. Ooh, that's scary. So when I don't sense a closeness to Jesus, I take over. Because if God's not in control, if I don't feel Him close up personal, then I think, well, must be up to me. And off I run. Yeah. As we keep talking about these trust trials that we face, we looked at the element of just the struggle that is a trust trial. And then, the pausing to remember how God has prepared us from other scenarios in our life and then bringing that relational collateral into the struggle. That really makes a difference. There's another element that helps me go, I must be in a trust trial. And it's the element of separation. Because a trust trial is a time when we don't experience God's presence for whatever reason. And I kind of want us to look at what are the reasons we don't experience His presence. Back to Matthew 14. Let's look at verses 22 to 24. Somebody grab those for us. And then we're going to look at Mark 6:45 to 47.
Okay, I got the Matthew.
Okay.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to the other side, while He dismissed the crowd. After He had dismissed them, He went up on a mountainside by Himself to pray. Later that night, He was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it.
What do you see there about separation?
Jesus, it says, made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead, and He dismissed the crowd. So that's kind of counterintuitive. That the separation is initiated by Jesus, at least the physical separation.
Yeah. I'm interested in that word, made them get in the boat. Isn't that interesting?
It has a sense of command, authority to it.
It does. And we'll look at that when we look at the Mark version, too. I'm interested, too, that Jesus was by Himself and He sends the disciples to where?
To the boat.
The other side of the lake.
Yeah.
But
The destination doesn't really even matter. This is interesting to me. What matters is they're not with Him.
Yeah.
Now, what can we make of that? What do you make of, he had just fed the 5,000. People are just super enamored with Jesus. The disciples are super enamored with Jesus as well. There is a way in which Jesus needs to get the disciples out of the way from this heightened, crescendoed moment of ministry. Get in the boat, go to the other side. And Jesus goes up to pray. There's no destination given. They're just told to get in the boat, get away.
Yeah. I also think, we talked in an earlier conversation about verse 13, where Jesus heard about what happened to John the Baptist, and he tried to withdraw to a solitary place by himself. And then that didn't really work out too well because the crowds heard about where he was going and followed him. Yeah. And so I think there's also a really amazing invitation that Jesus, who is both God and man, who needs the space to grieve and process what happened, and he prioritizes that by sending the disciples away, by dismissing the crowds, and by still prioritizing this space to pray, which has been a rhythm of his. We see that in other passages where he often goes away to spend time with the Father and be strengthened, renewed, talk with God, all of those things.
Yeah, I also think about how confusing it can feel when you sense the Lord leading you in a direction and then you experience the trial in the midst of the direction that you heard clearly that you were sent on. Like, God, what are you doing? Like, why would you put me on a boat and then have this wind whipping and this disaster, seemingly against me? And then also, even while I'm feeling distant spiritually from God all at the same time, this kind of is a good reminder of how those feelings are not indications that one is outside of God's will necessarily, but it's just this kind of trial season that you're in.
Yes, exactly. I think what we might miss here, remember, the disciples are freaking out. Okay, it's just a little bit further in the passage. They're freaking out because Jesus isn't with them, because the wind is coming up and they're straining at the oars, and they have been for probably hours here. And Jesus isn't there. I mean, he doesn't come until late in the night or early in the morning, and they are alone, and he is alone. There is a double, perhaps, effect of this separation. One is that Jesus knows he needs to separate himself for his own health, for his own separation, but also, I think, for God the Father's sovereign timing. They're wanting to adulate him. Everybody is wanting to adulate him into an earthly king. And Jesus knows this isn't the right time. So he's separating himself for God's holy purposes. But he also separates himself so that they will experience the trust trial, so that they will understand who he is as he comes to them in a miraculous sign. In just a few more verses, we will see this, walking on the water. Switch over to Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 47, and see how Mark describes this same situation. Bill, would you read that?
Sure. Mark chapter 6, verse 45. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land.
Okay, so he's still separated. And I love verse 48. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Okay, then shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. There's a time period in between him seeing them, him being by himself, seeing them straining, and then walking to them. Again, this whole idea of separation. One commentator talks about how he made them get into the boat because he didn't want the messianic frenzy to explode. And this Greek verb suggests that they were reluctant to leave him there. And there's this sense that Jesus has to expeditiously remove them from the scene in order to persuade the crowd to disperse peaceably and avoid some kind of a revolution there. But we do know back to, when we're in a trust trial, there's God's sovereign timing over us and the events in our lives And then there's also the very specific personal relationship that he has with us, where he is growing us more to look like him. What do you want to take away from this? What I take away is that separation is actually part of the trial. Just like preparation is part of the trial, just like struggle is part of the trial. Separation, that's another element of a trust trial.
I think about that phrase, straining at the oars, and the wind being against them just really leaps out at me. And I think sometimes it just paints this picture when you just feel like you're just stuck in the mud, like it just feels like nothing that you're doing is working, fear is creeping in. And in the midst of that, Jesus saying to them, take courage, don't be afraid, is the ultimate message that I take from this story and can apply it even to me personally.
That's good, Rasul. What I take away from it is, though the separation is a part of the trial, it seems interesting to me that when there is this separation, Jesus is the one who closes the gap, not them. It's not like they turn the boat around and go back to the shore they had come from, where he was. He comes to them in the middle of it, and I find that really encouraging.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of the whole story of the Bible. One of the themes is God saying, I see this misery of my people, and I have come down to rescue them.
Yeah. And, so when we're in a trust trial and we sense separation, we can trust that if we sense separation, it's for our good and God's timing. But B, Paul writes and is very clear, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So we lean into that even though we may sense separation, he is still there. The act of the cross and the resurrection demonstrates that he will always be there.
Yeah, this is part of the struggle that makes it a trust trial. The feeling of disconnect or separation that is so common. It was part of the trust trial for the disciples, and it often is an aspect of the struggles that test our faith and trust in God. All right, so question for you. Does the prospect of taking a risk make you panic, or does that kind of send a thrill down your spine? Well, I think it's safe to say that people have different levels of comfort when it comes to taking chances, because sometimes taking on risk works out great, life-changing in a positive sense. But sometimes it doesn't. Again, life-changing, but the consequences can be devastating. And so would you say that generally you are a risk taker or that you are risk averse? Well, risk is going to be the focus of this next part of our Bible study on Discover the Word. And whether you're a natural risk taker or whether you're generally more risk averse, there is a message for you in this next part of the conversation.
I want to invite you to think about sometime you did an exercise that helped develop trust. It could be something like share your deepest, darkest secret. It can be 3 facts, 1 lie. It could be a lot of things. Can you remember a situation where you were challenged to develop a trust and it kind of worked?
Classic trust fall.
Yeah.
So you're going to have all these people that you don't really know if they like you stand behind you and catch you, and you're just going to close your eyes and fall backwards. So it's a good thing there was a teacher there to say, you better catch him.
I think this works both with people and with the Lord, but I think about the often quoted command in Scripture, remember and do not forget. And I remember starting to keep something I call a faith file of just a record of things that God did that was significant and that was outside of my control, and then revisiting that. And I think the same works with people. In terms of just not forgetting the times and the ways that those who have had your back have demonstrated their care and support of you in deepest times. Because for some reason, the new crisis hits us in the day and we can just kind of forget, God's presence and faithfulness, and even those of others as well.
That's so true. I love that, a faith file. There's something active in all of these examples we're giving. I'm remembering I was on an Outward Bound retreat, which is a kind of a therapeutic retreat exercise where you go usually with another person or to build trust in a team situation. And I was up on the ropes course, and I was supposed to walk across this. It was kind of like a tightrope, between trees. And then from below, the coaches were going, okay, you can do it, you can do it. And I remember finally just going, I have to try this. But I did put my feet across and start walking. There was something active about this experience. And, as we look at elements of a trust trial, the one that I want us to look at in this conversation is the active one of risk. There is a point in which we enter the trust trial, not just like what it's all happening to me and I'm the passive victim here. It's I become an active participant and I decide how I'm going to respond. And that's where I want us to settle in today, whether it's in remembering or in falling or in drawing near to God, all those examples you just gave, you guys. I'd like us to look at both Mark and John's expression of this story of the disciples on the water, and then we'll go back to Matthew's. So let's start off with Mark 6, verses 48 to 52. Bill, if you could grab that one.
Mark 6, verse 48. He, Jesus, saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves, and their heart was hardened.
What do you see their action is? I mean, Jesus is the one who's coming to them, and they're terrified. What response did they give?
Well, their first was surprise. And when you read verse 52, they did not understand about the loaves. That almost feels like a disconnect, but really that goes back to one of the earlier conversations where instead of looking back at what Jesus had displayed of his power in the past and saying, wow, if Jesus could do that, of course he could do this too.
Yes.
They don't connect those dots together.
Yes. And when they climb in the boat, in verse 51, and the wind dies down, they do have a response. What are they? They're completely amazed. And Jesus has told them, take courage, it is I. The response is to take courage. We don't see exactly how they do it, but they end up being amazed. Okay, let's scoot over to John chapter 6, and let's pick up in verse 20 to 21.
But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading.
So they're out in the middle of the lake. They're terrified. In verse 19, Jesus comes walking on the water. They're frightened, okay? And he says, don't be afraid. And then what happens? What's the response that they have?
They willingly take him in.
Yeah, they take him in the boat. Okay, it's you.
Yeah, okay, it's you. And there's a kind of a double miracle there that I miss. It's that, he's walking on the water. They
Right.
take him into the boat. And then what happens? They're suddenly where?
At the shore, immediately.
Yeah, immediately,
Yeah.
which is like, did it just turn into a powerboat all of a sudden? Or, did the wind just scooted over there?
Or was their experience of Jesus' presence meant that however long it took them to get to the shore at that point, it felt immediate
I love that.
because they were finally at peace.
I love that. Or they're caught up in the amazement that Mark
Yeah.
describes, that it just nothing mattered anymore.
I think it's interesting, Elisa, for context, that these guys were professional fishermen, most of them. They had spent 6 days a week of pretty much their entire lives on this lake. And the fact that they were terrified in a couple of different ways, I think, says something about the strength of this trial that they were experiencing.
Yeah.
If we go back and remember that word tormented or buffeted, it really was a very strong experience. Let's go and now back to Matthew 14. And this is a little bit longer telling of the story, which includes a personalized trust trial for Peter, one of the disciples. So back in Matthew 14, let's pick it up and do verses 27 down through 33.
But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, Peter, became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God."
This is a fuller telling of the experience, and we get to see it from the eyes of Peter and the eyes of the disciples. I like how you pause there, Daniel, with verse 27. Take courage and don't be afraid. It's such an interesting combination of commands. There's this both and. Take courage, don't be afraid. Take this, let go of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason for those commands is because he says, "It is I." He's not just saying that in a vacuum that, hey, come on, buck up. He doesn't do that. He says, because he is there, they can take courage and they don't have to be afraid.
Yeah. And so what is Peter, how does he respond?
Yeah, if it's you, tell me to come.
Prove it.
And he said, all right, come on, let's do this. And it's a pretty phenomenal response to go from, hey, we think this is a ghost, to, hey, invite me to come and I'll walk on the water too.
And I love that Peter, I mean, we're seeing here his risk. He gets out of the boat at Jesus's invitation. But then as he's standing there and walking on the water, he freaks out a little bit and he starts to sink. And it's just these stair steps of risk that God invites us to. What I love, though, is that what happens when he does sink? What does Jesus do?
He lifts him out.
Yeah, in verse 31, he immediately reaches out to him, which I love. It's so comforting. And he says, why are you doubting? And it's the same word that he uses when he's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, verse 30, about worry and doubt. You know, when we doubt instead of trust, trouble happens. We sink, but he knows we're going to. And again, as we look at these elements of trust trial, we come to this crescendoed one, which is, we've gone through, here's the struggle, here's the preparation. Yes, we might experience separation. Risk. Risk is the one, I guess, that's under our control. For us to go, I'm going to draw near to you, God, when I feel away from you, or I'm going to allow myself to fall back and hope that the teacher instructs the kids to catch me. My choice in this trust trial is to risk. John Ortberg wrote a book called If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat. And the truth is, if we want to believe God is God and see him being God, we have to risk. So if you want to know who God is, you got to get out of the boat. You got to risk.
Yeah, that is such a memorable title, too, John Ortberg's book, that kind of summarizes this aspect of our study. If you want to walk on water, you have to get out of the boat. There's always a measure of risk in every trust trial. Well, to conclude this study, we're going to focus on the engagement and response aspects of a trust trial, because the outcome is never really a sure thing with one of these trust trials. It can go several different ways, and the trial doesn't always lead to trust. We'll see that in the gospel accounts of how this incident turned out, and I think it'll be a good caution for us to consider as we think about the trust trials that we encounter. All right, so the conclusion of our study of a trust trial, after we take 60 seconds to look ahead to where the group goes for our next edition of the podcast. Well, for the next Discover the Word podcast, Rasul moves over into the leader's chair for a series we're simply calling Parenting.
So I'm going to make a statement, and I want to see if you agree or disagree. Parenting is one of the most time-consuming, important, and challenging roles that we could ever take on.
Yeah, I think it could just be summarized as, what am I doing? Yeah, and I was listening to a comedian recently that was talking about how every stage you think is the hard one until the next stage.
So good. Yeah.
That is very true.
And while they will recognize that the Bible is not a parenting how-to manual, it only makes sense that the Bible and our faith in God would speak into something that is one of the more important aspects of life for many people, as being a parent and raising those kids that we love so much. So I hope you'll plan on being part of the Discover the Word group next time for a helpful series of conversations on parenting. Well, in this episode, the group's been looking at an event in the life of Jesus and his disciples that we find in 3 of the 4 Gospels, as well as the context surrounding when Jesus' disciples were in a boat on the Sea of Galilee during a severe storm, and how it was a trust trial for them. It, like the trust trials we encounter in life, provided the opportunity to choose to trust or not to trust Jesus. And so let's listen as Elisa wraps up this study called A Trust Trial by helping us all remember the different elements that we've talked about that make up these trust trials, and then helps us find in this story and in our lives how crucial the response is in determining the outcome of a trust trial.
As we look at trust trials, the elements we've covered so far, the first one is struggle, which is, it's an experience where we need to figure out what we believe about God we act out in our lives. That's a trust trial. We talked about an element of preparation. What's that element, and how do we see that?
It's looking back on how God has been faithful in the past and met us so that we might be able to engage whatever the trial is that we're going through with a little perspective of how God's met us before. Exactly. And that's not something that happens naturally. Typically, our first thought in a struggle is not, I wonder how God has prepared me for this. It's usually, the only reason we do that is usually if someone even outside of us, or a pastor or something we hear or something, reminds us that, maybe I have been prepared for this type of a trial. And then sometimes in the midst of it, our whole question is, I don't think I have been prepared for this, so God help me.
Yeah. It's like we get spiritual amnesia, or our memory device is wiped clean, the second we enter a trust trial. It's like, And that's because of that other element of a trust trial, which is separation. Just the sense that, where'd he go? He's gone. He's left me. And almost every trust trial has that sense of, he's not here, and I'm alone.
Yeah, there's a sense in which we are very much a people of, what have you done for me lately?
Exactly.
And we get so focused on the dark space that we're in that moment, that we really do get a little bit of amnesia about how God's provided in the past.
Yeah. I want to divide up some scriptures, and we'll be looking at them just really quickly for this last element of a trust trial, which is a surprising one, I think. I'm calling it engagement. So, Bill, would you get Matthew 14:34 to 36?
Okay. Matthew 14, verse 34. When they had crossed over, they, the disciples, landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
What happens after Peter walks on the water? They cross over and they land, and people recognize to Jesus. Okay, now let's scoot over to John chapter 6, verse 22 to 24.
I've got that. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus.
This is very different as well. What's different? What stands out to you?
Well, the focus is more on the first multitudes that were fed, as opposed to the second multitudes that were seeking healing.
It's like they've been chasing after Jesus, and they finally find him to get more of what they've already experienced. So they chase after him. Jesus goes on to describe and teach. In verse 25, they found him on the other side, and they said, "When did you get here?" They're all amazed that Jesus is now teaching after this whole thing on the water. And he teaches, and in verse 60, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you?" And after this time, in verse 66, from this time many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. This is the I guess, a hinge point, if you want to say. If we look at a trust trial, we see there's a struggle with what do we believe about God? And then we see, well, he's been preparing us, but I'm experiencing separation from him, but I have a choice to risk and know who he is. And when I risk and know who he is, I will become more engaged, which is what we see happen throughout the disciples' lives, the ones who stay. But in verse 66 of John chapter 6, it's clear that some turn away. And so they aren't engaged. And that makes me pause and ask myself, what might I miss if I refuse the trust trials? How might I disconnect from the participation, even in watching and observing God's ongoing faithfulness in the world? How does that hit you guys?
Well, I think it's interesting because it's a different trial that they run into at the end of John chapter 6 that is much more like deep theological, trying to understand Jesus's teachings in particular. And the teaching that he had just talked through is a teaching that to this day is confusing to people, and there's different ideas about what it means. It's kind of a forerunner to communion, but this idea of eating my flesh and drinking my blood is how you're a part of this community. And so it makes sense that they're confused because this is a very deep teaching that still confuses people in the church. And so it's almost a different kind of trial at this point of trying to get your mind around who this Jesus really is and what he's accomplishing. And it's also a reminder that the 12 disciples are not the only disciples that we read about. There's a lot of followers of Jesus. And this is, as you said, a hinge point of where the confusion, the trial of not understanding what Jesus is saying ends up being too much for some. And we can all relate to that in some ways because there's a lot of ideas that we run into in the church that are too hard for us to understand.
Yeah, I think, Daniel, you're right that it's a different kind of trial. It's also a different kind of risk. On the one hand, you had the risk of whether or not, in case of Peter, you were going to step out of the boat and walk to Jesus on the water. Here you have the risk of whether you're going to continue walking or if you're going to walk away. And it's a risk of what might happen if you stay in the boat versus what you might miss out on if you're not really continuing to walk with the Lord in his presence. It's a different kind of risk.
Yeah, and I think the thing I love about it that really wraps up this theme of trust trials so clearly is Peter's response. He doesn't give some type of deep apologetic or theological treatise. When Jesus asks, do you want to leave too? He says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. I don't know what you mean when you said, eat my flesh and drink my blood. I don't know what that means, but what I do know is that I'm riding with you because I have believed and put my faith in who you are. And that, at the end of the day, has given me so much comfort at times when I read stuff or experience things that I don't understand. And it's just like, but I trust you.
Yeah, and that verse has been really encouraging and important to me. In our very first conversation this series, I talked about how I feel like most of my life is a trust trial in some way of not understanding who God is or what he's up to or if he exists or all of those questions it's like surprising to me when I'm confident in my faith. And this has been one of the verses I've come back to so many times, like, where else would I go? Like, these are the words of life. And I think you're right, Rasul. There is a beautiful, simple trust there of like, I don't get it, but where else would I go? These are the words of life. That's what Jesus offers.
We look at Jesus walking on the water to the disciples in the midst of a storm and the utter chaotic impossibility of that scene. That's a trust trial. And then Jesus saying, come to me, Peter. And Peter takes the ultimate risk of getting out of the boat. And we think that's the trust trial. And it is. It is. But, just a bit later, with this dense teaching of impossibility as well. You go from a physical trust trial that's a belief trust trial to an intellectual trust trial or a theological trust trial that's a trust trial. And, Peter, his response is just as you all pointed out, where else am I going to go? But he also says, as you pointed out, you are the one, Jesus. You have the words of eternal life. I already risked. I got out of the boat. I saw who you were. I experienced it. And so in this way, one trust trial leads to the next trust trial, leads to the next trust trial, leads to the next trust trial. And we live a life of trust trials that thread together. Some will be better at than others. But to whom shall we go but Jesus? Because he is trustworthy.
It comes down to, how am I going to choose to live my life as a person of faith for whom the trust trials end in trust? Or will I choose to live a life of non-faith where I don't trust? Important questions that come out of our study together of this incident in the lives of Jesus and his disciples, what we've called a trust trial. And obviously, so much application to us and our relationship with God today. Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, Daniel Ryan Day, and Rasul Berry, your study partners here on Discover the Word. Discover the Word is a group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And remember, you'll find show notes for this episode that include scriptures for you to read, questions to aid you in your study with us, and really helpful links to additional resources. Explore this show notes feature that are part of each new episode on our discovertheword.org website. Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are a donor-funded nonprofit ministry. And it is the generous support of listeners like you that makes it possible for us to provide these Bible studies around the world. In addition to being available on all the major streaming services, Discover the Word airs internationally on radio, including in Canada and the UK, Fiji Islands, and across the U.S. You can help us fuel a global Bible engagement movement when you go to discovertheword.org and click the donate button that's up at the top of the page. Thanks. And thanks for listening. I'm Brian Headinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread